I'm just going to quickly try and update you on this, which, as you know, has been a really contentious area and what the new specific duties would require. Just by way of quick introduction, I've really taken this from things that the GEO and others have given me, which is about what the government is trying to do. And what they are really trying to do with the specific duties is make it absolutely clear that public bodies not only can, but should use procurement to drive equality. There's a lot of money spent, 175 billion pounds is spent every year through procurement. That's 13% of GDP. And if you're listening to how we're going to deal with the recession and the efficiency and all that, it's all about big procurement, lots of procurement, shared services, and then procurement. So if we don't get this in there, we're going to lose the scope to get things done. The government wants, I wouldn't say every single person in the government, I suppose, but those who are working hard on this, they want us to use our influence when we're procuring to drive equality considerations wherever relevant and reasonable. And I would say that in the recession kind of situation where people are vying for work, we will have additional clout which we can use. We can ask people to do things. If in your sustainable community strategy you talk about who your citizens are, worklessness and disadvantage, for example, you can then put requirements in not only to provide a service, but also to think about hiring unemployed people, providing positive action training, and all sorts of things. So whereas in the past they may have complained about it, and you do have to be careful doing it, now they will be keen to do it because they want our work. So that's what that's about. And what the GEO says, they want procurement, equality and commissioning officials and authorities to work together, which I think our survey research, which many of you were involved in illustrates that we don't always do. They want people to work together to say, these are the important contracts where we need to work on this, and also to understand together how they can use these new provisions where relevant, proportionate. Now I just wanted to mention relevance because you're all very familiar with relevance. And I think one of the things that you must kind of put in your armory for these discussions is that I think a lot of what you and I would see as relevant, some of our colleagues in service departments or in procurement don't see as relevant. And what you've got to do is relate it to all the stuff we've just been talking about, who we serve, who our citizens are, who our staff are. Most everything we certainly purchase in way of services involves people, either as staff or as citizens. They may even just walk past you or through you as you do it. In that case, there is some relevance, and then it's a question of proportionality. But sometimes we think the problem is the procurement. Some of it is their lack of understanding of what is relevant or not. So in a sense, you've got to take the CAA, the equality mapping, the gaps, the needs and disadvantage, so that people understand that almost everything you buy has some relevance. And finally, they're very keen that we should, which is a real turnaround, I can tell you, that we question tenderers on their compliance with discrimination legislation at the PQQ stage. That's the stage where you decide who you will ask to tender, and you discard people who are financially unsound and have bad references and so forth. And what they're actually saying is that they positively want us to use that process to test compliance, whereas in the past we were always being told that was a bad thing to do. It also enables us to use our purchasing power more strongly. So what do the proposed specific duties say? Well, they're fairly straightforward, and we're being asked to consult on these, and when we have a situation to sit down, we ought to talk about it, but also you should talk about it with your procurement colleagues and try and get a view on it. First of all, they're saying when you're setting your equality objectives, like Angie was referring to, and doing action plans, to include how public procurement will help to deliver these. So it really is asking you to take a very strategic view of how you're going to use these powerful and significant financial processes in meeting your objectives. I think that's where the sitting down together, the different kinds of people, equalities and other people, is particularly important. To consider the use of equality-related award criteria where they relate to the subject matter of the contract. When you put out any kind of documentation about procurement, you actually have, for transparency purposes, to lay out the award criteria will use the percentage of the amount of points that will go to it. And it's something that's an audit trail and people can complain about. And you need to make sure that the qualities aspects, be they direct or indirect, feature in that. Otherwise, when the chips are down, they won't select somebody. That won't actually come into play, because it's those factors are what will determine who gets the contract. Then the next thing they're suggesting, which is, I should say at the moment, only 30% of you reported that you had any award criteria relating to equalities, and they were predominantly in London authorities. And also equality officers reported that they were hardly, if ever, asked to help with thinking about it. So it's again this joint working. But the other thing they're talking about is considering incorporating equality-related contract conditions where they relate to the performance of the contract. That's separate, because that is saying that if you win the contract, along with a whole bunch of other clauses about what you must do if you win it, you will do certain things. You don't use it to decide who wins, but if you win, you have to commit to do these things. And there are standard clauses which a lot of authorities already use. You comply with the law, that if your staff will work alongside staff in the authority, they should abide by the same equalities, procedures and practices that you have and policies. Those are fairly standard, but there will be others that you can do. And one of the big conflicts always is how do you get SME, black and minority ethnic businesses, and third sector organizations to bid. Well, very often if you front load the contract with a whole bunch of stuff, they don't win the contract. But you can say, well, if you do win the contract, you've got to be willing to do more on these issues after you get the contract. So sometimes they say that you'll send your staff to be trained alongside us, or that you will do specific things. So one of these things enables you to pick it up in the actual selection, and the other is conditions that come into play if you win the contract. And there are two ways of kind of tackling this particularly. So those are things they actually want to have as requirements. And what we're interested in knowing, and you need to discuss with you, is that good enough, and will that really help you get the clout that you haven't had previously with your colleagues? Then there's just two other options I'll quickly mention, one of which I'm not very sure about myself, which is, do we want a requirement that we deal with people who breach discrimination law? Well, I think that's kind of weird. When you do PQQ and other things, you find out that people haven't. But very often those who've had a case are actually now better performers than people who've never been caught. But also it kind of puts us in the position of having to police and monitor a large part of the private sector, and I think you might want to think about that and whether that's useful. And then the other thing, which I think you all might think is quite helpful, and certainly your procurement colleagues would do, is whether we have a national standard for pre-qualification and so forth, so that if people don't have to constantly both be asked, the suppliers don't have to be asked lots of different questions by different authorities, and we don't have to assess every single company that applies to us, because if they've met these national standards, then you can tick a box, and it's done rigorously. I would say the EHRC is driving that, and at the moment it looks like they wouldn't actually have one standard, but they might have a model standard, and then if you were already doing the gold standard for London or some of these other ones, that would enable you to tick the box. But the idea is that it'd be quite a good and rigorous standard, that once people had done it, you didn't ever have to fill in forms or be tested again for another 2 years, and it would be quite efficient. So those are the things they're putting forward. They are quite strong, considering that these were things that people weren't very keen on until quite recently, and I think Angela's right that we have had some success in doing this, in part because you all contributed to some good research that showed there was some real problems. My view is we shouldn't need all this, because I think you actually can and should be able to do it now, but there's so much lack of clarity and contention about it. The idea is to make it absolutely bulletproof. So that's partially what we'd like to know from you now, or through the COPs or whatever. Is this strong enough? Is this good enough? Will this deliver what you need to get a seat at the table and get these issues into these big procurements that are going forward? Thank you.